In this video, I am going to talk about my grandfather, Zvi Preigerzon, the author of a book, When the Menorah Fades, which was recently published by Academic Studies Press. Zvi Preigerzon was born in 1900 in a small Ukrainian village. He developed a profound love for Hebrew language as a young child. He later wrote in one of his books, "The Hebrew thrill has poisoned my blood forever." His early stories caught attention of famous Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. Upon Bialik's recommendation that Preigerzon should pursue an education in Hebrew, his parents sent him to Gymnasia Herzliya in Tel Aviv, at that time Palestine, where all the classes were conducted in Hebrew. This experience had influenced his whole life. Unfortunately, his study in Gymnasia Herzliya was quite short. The First World War forced him to return to Russia, where he continued his education in Odessa.
After the Communist Revolution of 1917, Preigerzon had a short window of time where he was able to leave Russia. However, he decided to get an education first and only then to emigrate. It turned out that an onset of Stalin's regime made such a departure impossible. In 1920, Preigerzon moved to Moscow to study at the university, and eventually he became a professor of mining, an expert in coal processing. He and his family had lived in Moscow ever since. Zvi Preigerzon became well known in his field of work. His numerous inventions were utilized in the industry, and his textbooks were widely used by the mining students in Russia. The engineering achievements were not Zvi Preigerzon's main aspiration. His primary passion was writing in Hebrew.
During Stalin's regime, the Hebrew language was banned in Russia, but Preigerzon was not willing to cease writing. He decided to ignore the regulations and continued writing in Hebrew in secrecy. His novels and short stories were about simple Jewish people trapped in the reality of revolution, war, and destruction of their religious and cultural traditions. After the Second World War, the Holocaust became one of the major themes of Preigerzon's writings. It was very dangerous because the Soviet regime was withholding information on Jewish suffering during the Nazi occupation. In 1949, during Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, Zvi Preigerzon was betrayed by one of his friends, arrested and sentenced to 10 years in gulag. The official charge was being an Israeli spy. When in gulag, despite harsh conditions and hard work, Preigerzon was always ready to help and motivate his fellow Jewish prisoners. He talked to them about the Hebrew language, songs, literature, and traditions.
With the end of Stalin's terror in 1956, Preigerzon's conviction was revoked. He returned to his family in Moscow and continued professional work along with writing in Hebrew. Having learned an important lesson through his imprisonment, Preigerzon wrote his novels in complete secrecy, even from his own family. During that time, he composed the Memoirs of a Gulag Prisoner, describing his own prison experience as well as those of many other Jewish people whom he had met during his time in Gulag. Even though Zvi Preigerzon was physically removed from the land of Israel, his heart has always been there. He was following closely the Israeli news and always perfected his proficiency in the Hebrew language. His knowledge of the Jewish history was extensive, and in his writing he often used the expressions and metaphors from the Bible. In 1969, Zvi Preigerzon died of a heart attack. Until the end of the Soviet regime, the Preigerzon's literary works remained unknown in Russia. His handwriting were illegally smuggled to Israel and eventually were published there. The book, When the Menorah Fades, appeared in Hebrew in Israel in 1966 under a fictitious name due to the danger the author was facing in Russia. Zvi Preigerzon was able to hold the Hebrew edition of his first book while he was still alive, which was of great significance to him. The other books of Zvi Preigerzon, the collection of short stories, the Memoirs of a Gulag Prisoner, and the Unfinished Story, were published only after his death. When the gates of the Soviet Union opened to Jewish immigration, all Preigerzon's family emigrated to Israel. In accordance to his will, his remains were buried in Israel, and in recognition of his literary accomplishments, A street in Tel Aviv was named after him. Zvi Preigerzon's foundation was established by his descendants to translate and promote his literary works. We hope you enjoy the English translation of When the Menorah Fades, the first publication of Zvi Preigerzon's work in English.